So in many ways, of course, the challenge to the Western hegemony is something which is very welcome. But on the other hand, this challenge can be carried forward only if there is a deep theoretical analysis of an attempt to change the institutional structures through which the West dominates.
But
So
there is a process, at least here, in which the rise of the People's Republic of China, the rise of the BRICS, and the effect it has on limiting the hegemon's ability to do what the hegemon wants. And
I agree with you. Let me put it this way, that the existence of BRICS actually makes people aware that an alternative is possible. But BRICS itself is not necessarily that alternative. You see, I think the idea of de-dollarization in the sense of the role of the dollar being changed and the role of some other currency replacing dollar is really out. In fact, I would be opposed to that because
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amounts given in the link below. Without further ado, let me bring the second episode of Wolff Patnaik dialogue series. Today we are discussing BRICS Plus as an alternative to the current global world center on Western hegemony. Professor Wolff, if we could start with you, you have been sharing positive sentiments about the growing importance of BRICS. Of course, we know that BRICS plus nations collectively share 1/3 of the global GDP and 40% of the world population. More than 40 more countries have expressed their willingness to join the BRICS plus. Can you talk about your thoughts on whether you see BRICS as an alternative to Western-centered global political economic order?
okay, let me make my view on this very clear and blunt so we can get into the nuances in the conversation. For me, this represents one of the great changes of my lifetime, of modern times in our society. I am a product, my whole life has been lived since I was born early in World War II, has been lived in the hegemony of the United States on many, many levels. A hegemony that could not be and was not challenged in any fundamental way, economically speaking. Yes, the Soviet Union had weapons, and yes, the Soviet Union represented a complicated, serious political challenge. But when it came to the economic bedrock of the global system, the United States prevailed. It knew that it prevailed, and the rest of the world, whether they did it explicitly or not, had to acknowledge in practical terms what I just said. It was a dominant position. And it was from the standpoint of that dominance, and it was in order to maintain that dominance that the United States undertook with Mr. Nixon and Mr. Kissinger to stop acting as though there were no People's Republic of China, go there, meet Mao, and open up the language that a hegemon uses, open up China for the rest of the world. It did not anticipate, it did not expect that China could or would be able to develop economically in anything like the way and especially the historical speed with which it has in fact developed. And that misunderstanding, that miscalculation, by the beginning of this century that we are living in, has proven to be a complete and total game changer. That is, in the juxtaposition of nations in a world made up of nation states. I am not here talking about the underlying economic structure. And by that, I mean, in my understanding of Marx's work, the notion that the way you organize the production in a society is by the juxtaposition of employer and employee within the market framework, out of which you generate then exploitation, the appropriation of surplus, its distribution, and a society based on that organization. That has not yet been, in my judgment, at all basically challenged, not by the People's Republic of China and not by the BRICS as a collective. What they have challenged is the economic dominance of the West, of the United States, but of the G7, that is the United States, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany. That is gone. I do not think we will ever see that again. And it marks the decline of Europe and the American offshoot of Europe that is historic and that will play out in ways we haven't even begun to appreciate because we haven't seen it or we don't yet know what it is we are seeing. But of the fundamentality of that, with the qualification that the employer-employee structure, which is what I understand capitalism's core to be, that remains to be challenged. And whether and how the BRICS do that is at this point, in my view, an open question.
What I gather from you is that the BRICS clearly represents the decline of U.S. hegemonic power, while at the same time we haven't yet seen the fundamental restructuring of production in particular, but also to a large extent distribution. Professor Patnaik, if you can take it forward from here and also add your opening statements in terms of how you're looking at the emergence of BRICS plus nations.
Well, I agree with Professor Wolff that BRICS represent a real decisive change as far as the international power relations are concerned. But on the other hand, you see, international power relations are exercised or have been exercised by the Western powers through a set of institutions, through a set of practices, through a set of theoretical underpinnings to these institutions and so on. In other words, it is a certain view of how the international economy should be run. I agree with Professor Wolff that the employer-employee relationship is something which has not been challenged. Most of the BRICS countries, in any case, are really capitalist countries, including Russia and so on. But on the other hand, I believe they have not also challenged the basic perceptions underlying the institutions dominated by the West. For instance, if you look at the Kazan summit, the most they came to criticizing the Western institutions is the lack of representation of the global South or of the third world in the decision-making processes of these institutions. it is not just the lack of representation, but the fundamental kind of theoretical understanding of how the global economy should be run, which is something which is what informs these global institutions. But BRICS has not made any critique of it. In other words, the BRICS critique of the existing international power relations is something which really needs to be developed. In some ways, of course, it's a very positive development because, for instance, they are opposed to economic sanctions, unilateral economic sanctions that do not have the approval of the United Nations. And these economic sanctions have been used by the Western powers against all kinds of recalcitrant countries, including even freezing their foreign exchange assets. We have seen this happen long ago vis-a-vis Iran. This is happening vis-a-vis Russia. And it is an act of international brigandage, because after all, it's against all rules of the game, including the capitalist rules of the game. So the point is that to the extent that BRICS is opposed to it, and BRICS countries are willing to go against these sanctions, it would actually embolden other countries which are trying to break out of imperialist hegemony to do so. They would not be in as dire a strait if it is the case that such a large grouping of countries like BRICS is something which is willing not to impose sanctions upon them. So, in many ways, of course, the challenge to the Western hegemony is something which is very welcome. But on the other hand, this challenge can be carried forward only if there is a deep theoretical analysis of an attempt to change the institutional structures through which the West dominates. So we are at present in a very peculiar situation where some steps are being taken, which are welcome, but on the other hand, nothing very decisive is yet being attempted.
Professor Wolff.
Yes, I would. Again, I agree enormously. I would take it in the following direction, if you permit me. If there is no challenge in the sense, if I understand Professor Patnaik correctly, if there's no fundamental challenge to the employer-employee relationship, to what for me is the core class structure of capitalism, then it isn't so surprising that in the political system, you likewise get decision making made by a very small group of people at the top of these societies, often involving immense social risk to the mass of the population, including dying from bombing and warfare and all the rest of it. The and yet that's the premise of the international system, and BRICS doesn't seem to change that all that much. It changes who plays the role. With the desire for inclusion is the statement by the elites in the BRICS countries that they no longer be subordinated to those in the West. And I agree, that's an enormous step that is momentous in many ways we haven't yet seen. But I see a link there. If you don't challenge the organization of production, a small group of people, the board of directors, if it's a corporation, the owner of the enterprise, the person who started it, it doesn't really matter. A small group of people who make the decisions what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the output, which the mass of people have to help produce, but are then excluded from those key decisions. And then you replicate that in the political system, including the international system, and they are mutually reinforcing at that level of basic theory, basic orientation that Professor Patnaik was pointing to. And I think that's correct. And my hope is that the enormity of the change of the BRICS will embolden those caught up in it, by seeing what can be changed that they might have thought couldn't be, that they will now go on and be ambitious in what else needs to be changed to break finally, not just from the hegemony of one, but from the hegemony of any.
Professor Patnaik, if you could respond to that, add that, but just for me to throw in a question, perhaps following up on your argument that BRICS Plus is unable to provide both a theoretical alternative, but also an alternative to the dominance of Western powers. And here I'm thinking about, let's say, the IMF, World Bank, if we are if you are thinking about the power institutions. Now, one could argue that there has been attempts of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, for instance, or the new development banks within the BRICS. Um, is your critique tied to the fact that they are just less powerful? Let's say their assets are to the tune of 50 billion, 26 billion for the AIIB and the NDB respectively, as opposed to the IMF and the World Bank, which should have about 900 billion and 360 billion. So everyone agrees that these institutions are smaller, but is the critique just that they are smaller, or is it because they still lend in dollar, or they have been able to primarily address the question of global imbalance? Can you elaborate more on what could have been a better alternative in terms of finance, let's say?
Yes. I mean,
Yes.
okay, let me put it this way. We have a World Bank, and the BRICS answer to the World Bank is to set up an alternative bank. We have I mean, let's say we have the multilateral institutions in which there is a very dominant Western voice, and the BRICS answer is to widen the voice, give representation basically to the third world bourgeoisie in these. So it is not actually changing the structure in any way, but it is actually, shall we say, bringing in some fresh voices into that structure. But these fresh voices are not necessarily the voices of the people. They're not necessarily the voices of the oppressed masses of the third world. Let me give you an example specifically. I'm now not even talking about institutions, but let's say theories. You see, the point is not whether you make finance available to the third world countries on more concessional terms, on better terms, but the real need of the people of the third world is to break out of the hegemony of finance altogether. So it is not a question of finance on better terms or finance on worse terms, but the whole idea should be to break out of the hegemony of finance. And this requires a number of things. For instance, one very obvious thing. By the way, this is what Keynes himself had suggested, and he was no revolutionary in terms of his political views. That at the moment, in the international system, the deficit countries are forced to make adjustments. Okay. Now, at that time, there was a suggestion when the Bretton Woods system was being set up that the surplus countries must be made, must be forced to make the adjustments. Now, imagine the difference. If the deficit country is forced to make the adjustment, in that case, the deficit country does so by cutting down on its level of demand. The surplus country's demand remains the same. Therefore, taking the two countries together, the world demand has come down. On the other hand, if the surplus countries were making the adjustment, then the surplus countries would enlarge their aggregate demand. And if they enlarge their aggregate demand, in that case, taking the two countries together, the world demand has increased. If the world demand has increased, then the world employment would have increased, the world output would have increased. Therefore, one very, very elementary thing is that the rules are such that the deficit countries are forced to make adjustments. And this is something which basically has gone against the third world. They're deeply into debt and they're forever having to make all the austerity measures and so on and so forth, which is actually pushing their levels of living even worse. So the point is, one would have expected BRICS, okay, at least to say something about it if it was trying to represent itself as a spokesperson of the people of the third world. So I see the BRICS development as a very positive development. Of course, I completely agree with Professor Wolff. But on the other hand, it's not the kind of development which really I would have liked to see, because I want much greater consciousness about the pressures on the third world people, the pressures on the vast masses of people, not just the bourgeoisie in the third world.
Professor Wolff.
Yes, for me, the way I see it, coming at this from a slightly different perspective, I see, and this may be in part because I'm sitting here in New York City and therefore in a very different part of the global system than you are. But I see here in the United States a consequence of the rise of the BRICS. It's a consequence of many things, but among them, an important influence is the rise of the BRICS. So I am in a position of saying to you that the ability to question capitalism as a system has never been greater in the United States in my lifetime than it is right now. That is, the audience of our people here for the notion that the economic problems of the United States are exactly as I think Professor Patnaik is wanting us to see, that the audience in the United States is now more open to that level of criticism than it has ever been. It is aware in the beginnings of a consciousness, and that's all we have, the beginning of a consciousness of the decline of the American empire, an awareness that that's what's going on, is having the effect, at least for the moment, of opening the space here for the critique at the foundation of the whole capital worker relationship, that that's not an acceptable way to organize a society, and that a genuinely more democratic participation of the mass of people at all levels of economic decision making is the alternative that interests people. I am surprised that I can say that to you at this point, but I can. I'm overjoyed by it. I don't deny it for a minute. But there is a process, at least here, in which the rise of the People's Republic of China, the rise of the BRICS, and the effect it has on limiting the hegemon's ability to do what the hegemon wants, and that we see it as a nation more and more, has opened the space to do exactly what Professor Patnaik wishes to see more of, as I do too, but it is underway here. I cannot tell you if it will survive. I cannot tell you if it will last and spread. But for the moment, it's extraordinary.
I think the important point I should pick up from here is what Professor Wolff is saying is that there is indeed a perspective that has developed, especially in the West, through BRICS, that an alternative is possible and a better alternative is possible. And even if we don't have a full critique, even if there hasn't been an interlinking of primary means of organizing productions and trade and so on haven't changed, but there is an emerging consciousness that an alternative world is justified. And I think it's a good segue for me to ask Professor Patnaik a question on China, since Professor Wolff also mentioned it. I mean, there are two ways of looking at China within the BRICS. One view says that China plays a disproportionate role. It has about 70% of the GDP. It has about 47% of inter-BRICS trade. It also represents the largest amount of reserve assets, and so the argument is that the BRICS as a whole is not that strong. A lot of countries run current account deficit, for instance, and so their ability to export capital or come up with alternative forms of investment would be very, very limited if not for China. So that's one set of view which is critical about the rise of BRICS. But the other set, I think, argues that um, China, precisely because of its strength, opens up an alternative possibility around which other countries can come together and they can think about an alternative. So we are not talking about an ideal situation where every country has the same amount of share, but it's really under the leadership of a few set of countries, but others who join in really to come up with a better alternative than what exists. How would you respond to this set of debates?
I agree with you. Um, Let me put it this way, that the existence of BRICS actually makes people aware that an alternative is possible. But BRICS itself is not necessarily that alternative. In fact, if I can give an analogy, in one of his last writings, Lenin had written that the reason the Soviet Union survives is because of the fact that the Western capitalist powers are divided. That even though they actually attacked the Soviet Union together, nonetheless, there is sufficient disunity among them in order to allow the Soviet Union to survive. Now, in a certain sense, therefore, the challenge to the Western hegemony implies that actually now it is possible for an alternative, for some kind of a bold initiative to survive. But on the other hand, that bold initiative is not what necessarily the BRICS countries are doing. In other words, I think, if you look at most of the BRICS countries, they vary a great deal amongst themselves. You look at, I mean, you have the United Arab Emirates on the one side, India, Ethiopia, Egypt, and so on. So the point is, they are a kind of motley group of countries, but by just being a group which is separate from Western hegemony. I mean, not all of them are necessarily opposed to Western hegemony or would speak up against Western hegemony. I'm sure India under the current leadership would not. Even so, the fact that you actually have this alternative grouping opens up the possibility. And of course, it's true that China provides the dynamic to it. And in fact, I think most people have now come to expect China to do that. And that's a very major source of hope in having an alternative, whether or not you think of China itself as the alternative. For instance, when Sri Lanka got into the debt, the first question which everybody was asking is that, what, can't they go to the Chinese? Similarly, I think when the whole Greece question came up with Tsipras becoming the prime minister originally, and he backtracked on the promises he had made in the elections. The question on everybody's mind is that couldn't he have gone to the Chinese? In other words, the idea was that if you are going to break out of the Western hegemony, then the Chinese are there to give you some kind of succor. Whether or not you follow the Chinese model of development is a separate matter. But China, by its very existence and by its acquired strength, which Professor Wolff was drawing attention to, is now a country that actually provides some kind of an alternative source of hope and support and so on. And I think that Chinese strength and the Chinese ability is something which rubs onto BRICS itself.
This
I
is the
can
kind
give
of,
an,
sorry,
I
go
can
ahead,
give an,
Professor.
yeah, I can give an illustration. I'm in touch with people from a number of African countries, and in those African countries, I have noticed over recent years that the existence of the BRICS and of China, and this is in countries that have not yet joined or publicly indicated they wish to. Uh, but I can tell the kind of people I know, people on the left, et cetera, that it does exactly what Professor Patnaik said. It opens the space for them now to militate inside their countries with their political parties and their leadership, a way to say there is a different path that you could be following. You keep sending missions to London and New York to get the advice and to get the money and to get the deals made for the development of this country here in Africa. But you could explore a different, if you were to send the mission instead to New Delhi or to Beijing or Sao Paulo, and because you would get not only a different set of possible paths forward, but now you can get the funding that you used to think was only available in the West. You can now get, and you can see export markets maybe here if you got this investment. And the Chinese, particularly, are willing repeatedly to make such arrangements. It is changing the politics inside African countries, and my guess is more broadly than that.
Yeah, I was exactly coming to the African example. I recently interviewed economist Charles Abugre from Ghana and asked him about the importance of China, and his comment was exactly the same, that China has definitely introduced an extra element of bargaining power for most African countries, even though he had re-emphasized that the fundamental transformations in Africa should come from Africa itself, whether through regional blocking, block formation, or whether through national strengthening of the welfare state and domestic industries. I think I want to get to the question of the nature and scale of globalization that one should be thinking about when it comes to that alternative, and probably led by BRICS, probably not, because a lot of aspects that Professor Patnaik and Professor Wolff you are emphasizing here, including BRICS' inability to talk about the imbalance, for instance, or one can even add to that mix the continued importance of dollar, despite talks about de-dollarization. In fact, a lot of the lending that the New Development Bank does is in dollar terms. 90% of the trade that BRICS Plus country does is in dollar terms. And ultimately, it comes to the question of imbalance. What scale of globalization are we looking for? Professor Patnaik, if you can talk about uh, should BRICS plus countries be looking for or looking at BRICS as an alternative under some sort of limited globalization, by which I mean a kind of greater balance in trade and balance in capital flows? Or should BRICS plus countries be thinking about BRICS as an alternative to the current paradigm of globalization, but the alternative itself would be hyper globalized in terms of enormous amount of capital flowing out of China, or for that matter, Iran or UAE, Saudi Arabia, the other surplus countries? Or should they be looking at limited globalization?
No, in fact, I think within BRICS, there are certain developments which are quite interesting. Within BRICS, for instance, I mean, for instance, you have this development of a bilateral trade agreement between Brazil and China. Similarly, you have revival of bilateral agreements between India and Russia of the kind that used to exist at the time of the Soviet Union. You see, I think the idea of de-dollarization in the sense of the role of the dollar being changed and the role of some other currency replacing dollar is really out. In fact, I would be opposed to that because we really don't want another currency hegemon. But on the other hand, as the BRICS is saying, I don't think a BRICS visualizes that, but the BRICS itself is saying that national currencies should replace the dollar. By which I mean that if you have more of bilateral agreements, for instance, let's say the Chinese-Brazil bilateral agreement, or India could have bilateral agreement with other countries, that basically means that trade is done in your local currencies, in your national currencies, whose exchange rates amongst themselves are fixed. But on the other hand, if there is, let us say, a surplus or a deficit, then that surplus or deficit is carried over and is settled bilaterally by one partner, identifying the commodities it can buy from the other partner, in which case the role of finance itself disappears. You don't have to go to banks in order to finance deficits and surpluses. That happens because the deficits and surpluses are not automatically rolled over, are not resolved through bilateral agreements, but that happens because of the fact that we are in this world of multilateral trade in which dollar is the currency in which the trade takes place. And in order to get dollars, you have to go to Western banks, then they impose conditionalities on you and so on. So I think the whole hegemony of finance, the imposition of conditionalities, the imposition of austerity, the servitude to the World Bank and the IMF, all of this needs to go. And I think it will go only if, instead of the multilateralism we currently have, we don't substitute some other kind of multilateralism of a similar kind, but a different country being the hegemon, but we actually break up this multilateralism into regional agreements, bilateral agreements, and so on and so forth, where the role of finance is minimized.
But bilateral agreements itself would mean much more limited trade, isn't it? Because ultimately,
Yes.
if there is no recycling mechanism, I mean, you
Yes,
can
yes,
say that.
absolutely. I would be for much more limited trade. In fact, I don't see why. You see, because export-led growth can be counteracted by domestic consumption-led growth. Therefore, I visualize the situation where you export to the extent it's necessary. Of course, no country can be self-sufficient. You require other countries' goods and you export your goods. But your basic market cannot be the export market. It'll have to be through raising your domestic consumption. Now, during this phase of export-led growth, actually, in many countries like India, which are a success, so-called success stories, the nutritional standards of vast masses of the working people have actually declined. So the whole idea is to expand the domestic market. And as I was saying last time, that if you cannot expand the world market in a regime of export-led growth, then it just becomes bigger than neighbor policies that India gains at the expense of some other countries. While it would be much better if countries adopt policies which actually enlarge the domestic market. That basically means enlarging the growth rate of agriculture, peasant agriculture. That would mean raising the wages of the workers. That would mean raising the minimum wages, and so on and so forth. That would mean adopting welfare state measures. Now, of course, I don't expect existing regimes in the third world countries, which are bourgeois regimes, to be pursuing this. But I think what we are talking about, the new conjuncture in the world economy, opens up possibilities of this being followed.
Professor
I think,
Wolff.
yeah, I think this is there is nothing more important in my mind than what Professor Patnaik has just said. I mean, this takes us back to pointing out that when David Ricardo tells us that international trade is a win-win situation for everybody, and we look back on the several centuries in which one side did a lot more winning than the other, and that we still teach this nonsense, then you see the wisdom of what he says. Anything that would break those tendencies to calculate that you're a success if your rate of profit is this or that, rather than your social development is this or that, that's the mistake right there at the beginning. Yes, of course, what should be happening is not the specialization because of the framework within which the specialization takes place, which always impoverishes one part of the world and not the other. The trick is to break from all of that logic, to break from the capitalist way of thinking. I mean, when I teach it to my students, I try to get as simple as possible. If profit maximization is what you are doing, you are maximizing the flow of revenue to the profit receivers. Why are you not wage maximizing your development strategy when that would be the obvious, more democratic way to go? There is no answer to that. The bourgeois stands there, looks at you, doesn't know what to do. They have internalized profit maximization as a kind of code that governs all questions. What the cooperation among the BRICS nations makes possible, no guarantee, is that a different logic begins to find an environment in which it can grow. And one of them is, yeah, why are we? Look at the way that our conversation just went. You pose a question, you're right, about trade. And then Professor Patnaik breaks in and questions the assumption. Why should we be trade for? Why are we maximizing trade? What's the point of this? What? And then he opens up, we could have a different logic, a different goal, a different way of achieving the goal that contradict, and then maybe we don't need a hegemonic currency in the world. And then maybe we don't need half a dozen other things we have taken for granted that have hobbled the left in coming up with an alternative at a time when capitalism is vulnerable.
This is a an extremely helpful comment, Professor Wolff. I want to ask you, since Professor Wolff and both Professor Patnaik, you've been talking about building an alternative consciousness, and I think this ties to what we are doing through these small platforms. One of the strengths and advantages of the current dominant paradigm is that they have enormous institutions of power that control knowledge. I mean, the amount of studies that IMFs and the World Banks roll out, it's just incomparable to the few studies that BRICS Bank, for instance, do. And it's not just about the IMF and the World Bank. We have the Western universities. We have the enormous knowledge dissemination. I mean, one can question if it is knowledge, but information disseminations by the hedge fund managers, kind of impact that Citadel LLC or even rating agencies, S&Ps, Moody's, and others do. It's enormous. So my question to both Professor Wolff and Professor Patnaik is, just to build up on what Professor Wolff said, that there is definitely an inchoate emerging consciousness that an alternative is possible. What role should, let's say, for the lack of a better word, organic intellectuals like you should have in this contested moment of global politics?
Well, if I could answer, part of the reason I think we are talking about the BRICS is that they are an element of what is opening everything up. With all the qualifications and the criticisms, which are appropriate and should be directed at the BRICS, no question. Their heterogeneity, their willingness to accept most of the rules of the game, their disinterest in fundamental criticisms of the existing economic system, all of that. But it is a factor that opens up. Let me give you a couple of others. Yes, the universities are doing in the West what they have always done. But then again, two things. One, I am a product of the Western University. I am, in fact, a product of the elite ones here in this country that I went to school at, where I was taught. Half of my professors are Nobel Prize winning economists. Uh, they tried very hard to persuade all of us that capitalism was the ultimate achievement of the human race. And they failed. And not just with me. They failed. There's a consistent number of us for whom this did not work. Well, I still teach. I still teach at the New School University in New York City that you may know of, which is a little bit different university, but not fundamentally different at all. Now, in this situation, I've noticed the following. My students, in huge numbers, are deeply upset by what is going on in Gaza, deeply upset by the Israeli behavior since October of 23, and are questioning not only Israel, but are questioning the United States as the basic sole backer of Israel, and trying to understand what it means. And this is as true of Jewish students as of non-Jewish students. And the attempt of the government under both Biden and Trump to destroy, to crush, to arrest, to imprison people, deporting them, and so on, in order to keep the opposition down, and yet polling which indicates majority of Americans do not support Israel. This has the same effect. And let me be a little daring. I think that these and other aspects of the decline of American empire hegemony are coming together to open an ever wider space and an ever deepening space for the kinds of criticisms that Professor Patnaik and I have been spending a lifetime trying to develop and to disperse in our relative communities. And so you get from me an optimism that I have not felt before and that has been slow to emerge, but is now a very strong sense of what is going on.
Professor Patnaik, if you can add a little bit about the emerging dynamics on the global south in particular, because at least as I listen to Professor Wolff, one of the things that strikes me is that that kind of trend is not necessarily a trend in many of the global south, isn't it? Because at least insofar as the universities were concerned, there was a much greater share of, let's say, for the lack of a better word, heterodox economic thinking, right? But we are seeing both within media now, but also within universities, a kind of rise of neoclassical, neoliberal economic thinking that privatization is good and so on, and that is linked to what I was talking about in terms of dominance of the IMFs and the hedge fund managers and so on and so forth. I wonder how you look at it.
You know, firstly, you asked the question what I think organic intellectuals should be doing at this moment. The one sentence answer to that, as far as I can see, is that they must speak the truth. That they must speak the truth as they see it, which is not what most intellectuals do, because what they do is what is demanded of them by the profession. There's a tyranny of the profession. If you're an economist and you cannot get a publication in a reputed journal, which therefore denies you promotion, which therefore denies you even a salary increase, if it is the case that you're actually arguing something which is not fashionable. So the basic thing that an organic intellectual or anyone who's an honest economist or an honest social scientist should do is to speak the truth. Now, one of the things I think, about the question you raised, when I was a student, neoclassical or orthodox economics was in disarray. Decolonization had happened. Nobody could deny that India had been exploited by British colonialism for 150 years. So there was all kinds of new thinking was bursting forth in the world of economics and similarly in other subjects, that you could not really have one hegemonic narrative at that time. And this was true even in the kind of diversity of views which characterized economics and characterized development economics. But I think from around the 1970s, using the example of East Asian success story, the Ford, the Singapore, and so on and so forth, a narrative began to be developed that really you open up your economy. This whole business of governments planning the economies or giving subsidies to the people or interfering with private enterprise is something which is not very good. And that was, of course, carried forward by the hegemony of finance and the fact that the World Bank and the IMF changed their roles. They were not originally meant to play the roles they are doing now. With the hegemony of finance, they really became, as it were, the gendarmes of international finance capital. They really looked after the interests of international finance capital. So the point is that a change took place. This change had multiple dimensions to it. One, of course, the hegemony of finance. The second is the tyranny of the profession that carries it through. All this Nobel Prizes, for instance, that's an example of a tyranny of the profession. That fundamentally, you tell the third world economists or third world countries that look, you're no good because the clever fellows are sitting in Chicago and your university and the clever fellows sitting in Chicago tell you the free market is very good. So it's a so there's a tyranny of the profession, and I think that plays a very important role. But I completely agree with Professor Wolff that actually now the world is changing, as you were saying, the anger among students about Gaza. I have not seen capitalism appear so morally bankrupt as it is now doing in the last 50 years. And I think that is really, there's an economic crisis, there's a rise of fascism everywhere, neo-fascism. There is Trump destroying, kind of, or attempting to destroy liberal thinking in universities, attacking the left and liberal elements. And there is this genocide going on. Every day you hear about, scores of people dying in Gaza. So I think because of this, there's a kind of revulsion against the existing order which is building up among students. And I think that revulsion is the starting point of something new in terms of intellectual ideas and so on. I think in the coming few years, we are really going to see a blossoming not only of people's movements, but also a blossoming of creative intellectual ideas.
Professor Wolf, we'll have more time on the next episode on this, but if you could briefly respond to the tyranny of Nobel Prizes and how the academic industry, by encouraging certain modes of production of intellectual knowledge, traps us into this hyper financialized capitalist world, that would be great.
Yes, well, I don't have all that much to add to what Professor Patnaik said. The Nobel Prize, there's no need to focus on it, but it does its job in making sure everybody knows what counts as good work and what counts as bad work or irrelevant work. Uh, Absolutely, it celebrates that all the great thinking is being done by a handful of scholars at the same institutions in the West that they have always been chosen from, overwhelmingly, in the United States or Western Europe. It's transparent. It's obvious. Uh, when I announce to my students each year what I think about whoever won the economics prize, I remind my students that the gift comes from a person who made the money that goes into the gift by developing dynamite as a way to destroy large numbers of human beings, and they ought to keep that in mind. And they all laugh, they all understand what I'm saying. Nobody is scandalized. I think this is all fading, and I think for the first time in my life as an academic here in the United States, the debate among my colleagues has shifted. The age old debate, which is the unspeakably boring conversation about whether a little more government or a little less government is the good thing or the bad thing, whether you should be a Keynesian or a neoclassical, as if that were what we ought to be debating, is looking as lame and weird and off the mark as it always was. And when I introduce, we could be discussing a hierarchically organized production system, capitalism, with a horizontally organized worker cooperative alternative organization of production, they all look at me and say, "Well, hasn't that been debated?" And I smile and I allow a moment to pass, and then I say to them, "Never in my education did any professor, with one exception, when I was a student of Paul Baran's in Stanford many years ago, he introduced during the semester that question, but never before and never since, in all the elite in the universities I spent my life, did anybody think this was an interesting question. Now I have opportunities to make that the interesting question on a scale I've never seen before. And I think that is in part thanks to China and the BRICS. And I want to acknowledge that.
We'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Professor Wolf and Professor Patnaik. This was episode 2, focusing on BRICS and the possibilities of an alternative world. We would come back next month with Professor Patnaik and Professor Wolf again to further investigate the long history of economic thought, how dominant trends were built, what was their role in restructuring societies, and what has been alternatives that have remained at times at margins and at times have risen to center in terms of economic thinking. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.
Thank
Thank
you.
you
Thank
as
you, William.
well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of the day ahead.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.